APA website or you go to the military and find the research on PTSD, EMDR is a suggested possibility, but they say there's not enough empirical research to see if it truly makes lifelong change. What they've discovered, at least the APA says, American Psychological Association, is that it works and then it fades. You have to redo it. It works and then it fades. So they're looking really hard to see, maybe it's the way, there's different versions of it now, right? And so if there's like more of a pure way that might work, so there's a lot of research about that. So that's one thing I'm going to say. Okay.
So in my personal experience, and from a few people that I know personally that have gone through it, one issue that arises is that it can fade. Another issue that's been found, and this is one that I experienced, I was not able to go back and change what I was seeing and the situation that I was in. And I actually got stuck for a period and couldn't get out. So I basically had to start therapy all over again and retrain myself that I am safe. This is where I am, and it was literally months of constant grounding to break because I was locked. So there's good stuff about it, and there's bad stuff. I mean, everybody's got their own experience. For me personally, I'm not a fan, but that's not to say that it's not right for somebody else.
I don't know. I mean, clearly, there are some people that say, man, this changed me, and it did. And there's some people who had a negative experience, probably like almost anything. There's also a spiritual kind of EMDR, too, that goes back in time called inner healing. They use the same kind of principles, but they really tie it into a deep, deep spiritual thing, usually connected to demon possession or something else, right? So some of those people will use EMDR with this deep spiritual component, and it's different, but they refer to it as the same. So it depends if you're doing it as a clinical set or with that's kind of spiritual insight. And you can't tell somebody they're doing something right or wrong. You just have to realize you have to be sensitive no matter what you use, right? And I'm definitely wanting to know anything and everything about anything. So, I mean, I just want someone to be healed. Yeah.
I had some success with emotional freedom techniques, tapping solution, and I just wondered if you all had the same kind of success. I work with trauma and children, adults, whatever age.
Right.
Because I've been using it for that.
Right, so there, if you look at the International Society of Trauma, something like ISTSS, right, they have, best practices, all kinds of research. There's a section on their website that lists worldwide all the things that people say works for trauma. And then they sort of rate them, and they tie them to research articles. So even the worst thing will work for somebody. So you have to sort of take that all in and look at the statistics, kind of see what's going on, and there's so much, because even more so than the mode or the method or the philosophy that you use, right, is the environment you create, right, and the connection, because the number one thing, right, to heal someone, if you're going to heal somebody that has trauma, is the release of oxytocin. If you can get the oxytocin to come back and to flow, right, they start to feel like things are better. So that's why people in the first couple of years of life who have a strong bond, right, and the oxytocin is really strong, tend to have a better sense of resiliency.
So I do want to say that I know quite a few individuals that if you can ground enough to be able to use tapping, it actually does, from a personal perspective, enhance the grounding experience and allow you to center at a quicker rate. So there are some really good things, but it's like anything else. It works for some and not for others.
And I think the other thing, most research gets compared to CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy or something, because that seems to be like the gold standard, whether it works or not. It just has way more research behind it, right? And like any good researcher, if it doesn't work, we don't refer to it. We refer to the living stories. So, but that is the one that everybody kind of says, okay, here's this, right? Any other questions about anything up to now? Yes?
I was curious, you talked about the three types of trauma processing, the acute, chronic, and complex. So the acute is more the sympathetic activation, and the
It depends on what is all connected with the complex, right? So let me think of, so I'll use my example. So my great-grandfather was a murderer, really a scoundrel, right? Went to prison, escaped, lived on the run, got caught, died. My father, murderer, went to prison, escaped from prison. We lived 5 years on the run. Everything on the planet happened to you, right? And then there's me. So when people look at me in our family, right, they always say, well, what happened to him? Because I'm the abnormal one, right? I didn't have that same sort of trauma. But what I did have is when I was young, the doctors that we went to see told my father, if it was up to me, I would medicate everybody in your family, even before they ever experienced trauma. Because from birth, I was a nervous wreck, right? I was just anxious, highly, highly anxious. So that's how complex trauma kind of gets into your DNA, and you weren't shaped in that way. You actually came out that way, right? So I don't know if that's maybe a poor example, but that kind of idea. Any other questions? Yes?
One of a practical question, how do you go about explaining this to a client when they first come in? These are really large concepts for somebody to...
Yes. I only explain kind of how a memory is formed in a very light way. This is exactly what I do. So I will have... Oh, well, not that. Okay. So what we do is I draw a circle, right? And then I draw a line at the bottom of the circle. And I say, she's going to get to that in a minute, too.
We'll get to it in a minute.
She drew a mandala. Okay, so if someone comes up and I talk to them, right, and I have established some sort of bond. If I haven't established a bond, I wait. Because a lot of them are confused about it, right? And if they say something, and they're aware that something's happened, I don't let them get into the details in the beginning. I just let them tell whatever they want to tell and talk to them. And then I always will tell them about, how do you process things that happen? How do any of us process things, right? So I just draw a circle. And I said, that's kind of, life. That's the best circle I've ever driven to, by the way. So then I'll draw a line here, and I'll say, this is an event. Right? Something happens. Well, how do we make sense of it? Like, how do we know what to do with it, right? So I said, okay, an event happens. That event goes into your brain, and in your brain is this file cabinet. And I always say, hey, don't judge me by my drawing. So we have a little humor in it because it kind of de-escalates. And I said, so every event that happens goes into the file cabinet, gets stored, right? There's either, this is my pathetic manila folder, either it's stored in one of those files or a new one's created, right? So that's like, it makes sense, right? So this is what happens. I say, get. So then I tell them the story of the dog and the cat. Every time, right? So I talk about how I store memories of my dog or how I store memories of the cat and in there. And then I say the interesting thing is, right, every memory we have is distorted, right? It's not 100% accurate. So, but attached to each file, right, are emotions. So then what happens is, when something happens, an event takes place, right, we check our file cabinet for something similar. If it's nothing is there, then we create something new. But if it is there, we pull it out, open it up, and out jumps the emotions. And then what happens is, we usually react to the event based on those emotions, and we overreact. And we may not even be aware of it, right? So I get them thinking about this. And usually that's enough, well, always, that's enough to get them intrigued, saying, wow, you told me something I never knew before. Now they're open, right? Now they think, perhaps there's hope, right? Perhaps there's some kind of understanding, something that could make a difference, right? So that's how I kind of get it in there. Obviously, I don't talk about the amygdala, I don't talk about all those other things because, number one, I may not remember the word in that moment, like freeze or faint. But I try to keep it as simple as I can, and I usually get a piece of paper, turn it around, and with them over there, right, I have them look at a clipboard, and I'm drawing it, and we're just sort of talking about it, right? So it never looks the same. I don't actually do it on a whiteboard. And I do that just because I just want it to be as relational, and that's just kind of like me, right? Yeah, if I do an addiction group, right, I will do it on a whiteboard and still do that, and then I'll layer it because I have them for 3 hours, right? So we'll go a little bit deeper, right? And so it will change if I do it in that setting, if that makes sense. So I don't know, does that answer that? Okay. Any other questions up to this point? Yes? Well, obviously, if it's passing through, right, it's in your genetic code. Now, and then anything can be shaped. Like, you can make it much worse, right? You can make it much better. So, like, for me, if I was born, right, like, my mother tells me one of her favorite memories is that my grandmother was like a manager of an apartment complex that had like 15 stories. And it was in Pontiac, Michigan, and the stairwell was outside along the edge of the building, right? One of these, like, terrifying, right? I still remember it. She goes, yeah, I was up at the top and I tripped one day and I fell all the way down. And you survived. I'm thinking, why are you telling me that? I don't want to know that. That explains so much, right? But because it was highly traumatized, right? Instead of learning a good way to process through the anxiety, I didn't have a lot of good oxytocin, if any. It just made everything worse. So now you see the environmental impact that magnified it, right? So if I would have been raised in a house where everything was really calm, and I was calm, and I was taught good skills, and it was very loving, and they tried to get that oxytocin out, and maybe here or there, I stand a much better chance of living a non-anxious life. So does that make sense, sort of? Okay. Yes.
On that note, epigenetically, I'm seeing a woman who suffered from trauma and, long history of family trauma. And we talk about how it's passed down, even though she's been through it. If she's wanting to start a family, do we then encourage a lot of grounding and like stress-free lifestyle to try to prevent it from passing down?
Yeah, number one, I wouldn't tell her it's going to be passed down, obviously. You probably didn't. But I would try to give her skills, right? And to kind of explain how do you envision, like, that night that the baby's not going to sleep, and we're all like, oh, how can we, I get them thinking scenarios. So they're like walking it through. One of my favorite things to do is to say, look, pretend you're a movie producer of your life. So as the movie of your life plays out, stop it. And then step out of the movie. And then rewind it and just look at it. And if you can detach clinically, kind of watch what everybody is doing. And then ask yourself, what could I have done differently? What could I have interjected here? Like, if I would have done that, what would have happened? Or if I would have went this way. So if it gets them thinking of real life scenarios and gets them thinking what they could do, then basically you're putting them through a boot camp so that when they go to war and something happens, they already know how to react. You're kind of giving it to them without them knowing what you're doing. I don't know. That's probably what I would try. Any other questions up to now? Okay, so a person goes through all this trauma, right? Now they wake up the next day and they're like, oh, what's the result of living, experiencing that trauma?
So, in simple terms, they're edgy, hyper aroused, they don't trust, they have an enormous amount of triggers from the sight of things to the smell of things. Smell is huge. It is probably the biggest trigger. The smell of somebody's cologne, the smell of food cooking that happened to be cooking earlier that day, things you wouldn't necessarily directly relate to it. Like Doc talked about the oxytocin, and they have that inability to bond with other people because, again, they don't trust. Their brain is kind of stuck in that survival mode, survival instincts. And then there's physical symptoms. They may be dealing with stomach aches, they may be dealing with muscle pain or headaches. And oftentimes those things are misdiagnosed by doctors because they're not actually physical. They're coming from the stress that the body is constantly under. You ever get an upset stomach when you're all stressed out? Headaches? I get knots in the back of my neck when I'm stressed. So I think that we really have to be aware of how they're experiencing it. And be aware that it's not the same across the board. You know, for me personally, like, I have a lot of trouble forming connections with people. I'll have people come up and be like, "You're my best friend," and I'm like, cool. Because I don't feel it. That part of me is not there. I realize that if I'm in an uncomfortable situation, I tend to mentally and emotionally just kind of check out. It's like everything glazes over, I can't focus, I can't remember anything that was actually said, but I'll remember what somebody was wearing. I'll remember how they smelled, but I couldn't tell you anything about the conversation. Completely blank. I give up on people really quickly. You know, one shot done, I'm not a second chance type person. I've experienced a lot of trauma in my life, so if something doesn't work the first time, I'm done. I'm not putting myself in that place a second time, and that's bad, because I'm sure I lose a lot of good relationships that way, because we're human, and we're fallible, and we make mistakes. And even though I know that, when it comes to my personal life, it's not something I can do. I'm really distant. Like, I have friends that will intentionally reach out to me because they're like, "Hey, I haven't heard from you in 2 weeks. Are you okay?" I'm like, "Oh yeah, I forgot." You know, I just set reminders in my phone like, "Hey, call this person, text this person." So it comes out a lot in those ways.
So you can imagine a person could experience all kinds of different things, right? They could be really emotionally cold, they could be emotionally needy, you know, the opposites. You can, you know, emotional cutoff, or you become like a sponge and soak up your environment because you're all, you know, entangled with everything, right? And anywhere in there, anybody can make that change. When I went through the trauma I did, right, how I survived it was I learned to put on a great facade and to become like the A-Team was a TV show back in the day, right? And there was a guy that the character was Face. He was the con man, right? That's who I wanted to be. I wanted to be able to deflect, to use my words, to read people. That's how I would survive, right? And so I could dodge a bunch of stuff. But as you get older, what you realize, the price of that is you have to live a lie, right? So I remember one day, because for years I was a pastor, and I remember once sitting in the fellowship hall of a church, and our worship leader who was on staff, right, so he was like a worship pastor, came up to me and put his hand on my back. I about had a heart attack, right, because I would always sit where I can see people. I'm always aware of where people are, right? Even today, when I go into a restaurant, I look and I sit down, and if I'm not like aware, then whoever I'm with has to give me cues. Like, I don't know, it just happens, right? So there's things that follow you, and there's things that as a therapist I have to remember too, that when someone comes in, because I know the power of touch, right? I know that if you can appropriately touch somebody, even if it's a handshake in a counseling situation, right? Right? Or if you can, you know, if it's in a relationship, right, you put your arm around them or something else, you earn psychological points. It makes them feel better, right? But I don't do it, right? I have to remind myself, oh yeah, hug them. Like my older two kids, when I see them, especially my son, I think, oh yeah, hug him. I have to tell myself, like, I know I want to do it. I just don't, right? I know I love him and would do anything in the world for him. But I know my bond isn't as powerful as some people's bond. And there's nothing you can do. You just do the best you can. But those are the direct results of going through trauma. So there are things that sort of stay with you, and you have to just, like, it could overwhelm you, right? Someone comes in, you're thinking, like we had someone just walk in our office yesterday and say, hey, and give us all the stuff they've gone through. And the first thing you want to do is shut the door and say, okay, down the road, there's another therapist. We want to make a difference. So you just take a breath, okay, let's do this, right? And you have to kind of recenter and move forward, because we do what we do to help one person, right? I just want to help one. And then as they get better, I'll focus on helping one person, right? And I just want it to be truthful and honest. So if things work, great, tell me they work. If they work most of the time, great, tell me they work most of the time. But don't. Like any of us who've done therapy for any length of time, right? We know the games, we know the speakers, we know, what really works? What's the real truth? I want to know that. What's the research? What does it really say? And who's doing it, right? What's the bias? What drug company is supporting it, right? I want to know, right? Because I remember telling people, oh yeah, antidepressants, they're not addictive. And they're not. They have a different word they use. So then I asked, well, why do you use that word? So, well, the drug companies told us we can't use this word. They're not addictive. You develop a dependency on it. Doesn't that sound much better? Well, you're not addicted to Prozac. Yeah, I mean, you got electric bolts of fire in your head, but it's not addiction, right? You're just dependent on it. Yeah, you may be dependent on it the rest of your life. Yeah, well, sorry for you. No one tells you that, right? They should tell you, you take anything and put it in your brain, your chemistry is going to change, and then you take it away. Guess what? Your brain may want it. I call that addiction, but we can call it dependency. It's the same thing, right? Your brain is changing and it's craving and it's wanting. No one ever told me, well, how do you get off of an antidepressant if you get the zaps and everything else? Do you just switch to another one and then you feel better? Or do I go out and get drunk every night? Because now, how do you get off Suboxone? Well, I go and get back on heroin, and then I detox off that because it's way easier than Suboxone, right? No one tells you what really works, but there are things that do work. Well, I want to know those things, right? I want to know that if you're getting the zaps, that you can take 5-HTP for a short period of time, and there's a certain dose that will actually eliminate the zaps, and you can walk yourself right off it and not experience any withdrawal. Well, no one told me that. That would have been a handy little tool, because everyone stayed on the drug because they were afraid of getting off it. Anytime you're afraid of getting off something, right? That is, I don't know, I guess I would call that addiction, right? So to really know what works really makes a difference. So when we deal with trauma, right, it's very real, and it happens, and it's all around us, and different traumas are treated differently. And you kind of got to know the lingo, you got to know who you're dealing with. You come up with a soldier, you're going to have some understanding of what a battlefield is like and use some of what they're telling you, right? It's a little bit different than if you meet someone who comes from a trafficking background. It's different. The principles are similar, but each particular case is different, just like each particular person is different, right?
What did you say that was?
You can take 5-HTP. I can't remember, I have it written down in my office, but I forgot the dose. There's a sweet spot of a dose that you can take, but I can't remember, because if you take too much of it, it can mess you up, right? So there are things that you can do to kind of help yourself come off of stuff without feeling that, and that's really important. Now remember, that doesn't mean if you're depressed and you come off it, you're going to be depressed. It just eliminates the symptoms, especially the zaps and that lightheadedness that's pretty common for a lot of people.
Is that something that psychiatrists are recommending to you?
No. Nope.
Isn't that one of the chemicals that they're pulling out, the THC, like the CBD? Isn't the HTP another one of?
Well, there's all kinds of interesting things, right? But what you know about 5-HTP is it's directly connected to serotonin, right? And that's what's going to help you deal with that, right? Remember, too, that a lot of people will try to use something that messes with the GABA receptor, right? So if they take Valium or Xanax, and that works because it disconnects, right, the recall of the memory. So then if you're in the midst of trauma and you're trying to pull it from your hippocampus, right, the GABA receptor goes in there and goes, you don't really want to think of it. And you're like, you know what, you're right. I just feel better not having to worry about it right now. And it works until it leaves your system. Marijuana, and I'm not saying you should use it or not use it, I'm just saying, remember kind of one of the things it does. So because your memory bank is in the hippocampus, right? When I have trauma or PTSD especially, then what's happening is that emotional memory is jumping from the hippocampus into the now, and I'm having this experience. But I'm having this experience because it's in my memory. So if I can clip my memory, I don't have PTSD. So what does marijuana do? It basically, you take a pair of vice grips and you go to that little cord that's connected to your memory and you just crimp it. And now, I don't think of my memory. And I'm okay. But when I unlock it and it leaves my system, it can flood back in. So it does do something. And it teaches you something. But it may be not what you think it's doing too. So just be aware of that. Yes?
You keep mentioning this term, the zaps. I'm not familiar with the experience of what the zaps is. Could you describe, please?
Anybody ever have the zaps? Okay, how would you describe the zap?
You feel kind of dizzy. You feel just like, whoa. You just kind of like this rush of whatever comes over you that just feel your equilibrium off a little bit. It goes through you, but it's.
So there's that. What's the zaps? It's literally like, oh, I mean, it's like a little bolt of lightning that goes, like, I mean, it hurts, right? You actually feel an electrical impulse of energy going,
It's a fun bone, but hit every place in the body.
yeah, and it's just like, what in the world? Like, you literally, it freaks you out. Like, I mean, it's bad.
It's traumatic.
It is. So if you've had those,
But I want to know why doctors don't, like when I was told doctor about it, that doesn't make sense, that I'm making it up.
right, well, I have some really good friends who are psychiatrists, and what they will do is we'll sit down and they'll say, well, Patrick, you know you can't be addicted to an antidepressant, right? And it's like, okay. Then what's happening in your brain? Well, it doesn't affect everybody like that, and so, you know, and they just won't go there. There's no one, remember, if it's, what are those kind of drugs called? They're not pharmaceuticals, they're the other thing. What?
The holistic alternative.
Yeah, whatever, there's a term for it, but yeah, something like that. So there's no research on that, right? The FDA doesn't approve any of that. So psychiatrist isn't usually, the only thing they'll recommend is like folic acid, because that helps the receptivity of whatever you're taking, right?
So supplement, like an herbal supplement.
But most people don't, like, since there's no research, if a psychiatrist tells you that, then they're liable for the results. So they're not going to tell you that, because if they're in a courtroom and the courtroom says, what's best practices, they're not going to say, well, in my experience, it works. What they're going to say is, where's the research that validates that you did this protocol? And if there's no research, they don't do it. So that's the difference, right? So I'll tell people, look, I heard this, I heard that, you can go there, whatever, but, you know, you have to kind of decide. But it's so medically, you can't really tell somebody, well, as a therapist, you can't tell them anyhow, but, you know, they're not really going to give you something that doesn't have the research behind it, right? A nutraceutical, that's what it is, nutraceutical. There it comes. Yeah. But there are things that do activate GABA, but even those natural things can cause OD and addiction and stuff with a high enough dose. Because right now there's a big, everybody loves Kratom. And Kratom is just an opiate, right? I had a client die the other day from ODing on Kratom. You just have to be careful. It's a natural thing, right? But it's very deadly. Yes?
A client who's had a lot of success with Kratom, but he takes it once a week with a little vial.
Right.
But, I've done some research, but it's selling in my county.
Right. They're trying to make it illegal right now. But they've been trying for a couple of years because Kratom is an opiate. It does the same exact thing, right? And so it does the same thing. You take enough dose, it shuts down your system, you die, right? So a lot of people will go from heroin or something to Kratom, but it does the same exact thing. And so you're not healing. Those receptors aren't healing. They're just being kept alive, right? And so it's just, for an addiction side, it's kind of dangerous. Yes?
Have you had any clients on marijuana that it
Yes. Because marijuana actually is not used for anxiety, it's a hallucinogen. So, if you're anxious and you take it, I tell people this. Like, if you go in and take, like, I'm going to go have surgery. And when the anesthesiologist, whatever, comes in and says, hey, we're going to give you this anesthesia, and I'm like freaking out. Like, I'm like pulling at my cords, I'm just like, oh, and they put me under. How am I going to come out? Oh yeah, swing, let it go. I tell people marijuana's kind of like that. Whatever you do going in is kind of your experience going out. So, because there's so many other things in there, right? And this is, I don't mean to debate whether it's good or bad, because I'm sure people got whatever, but that's just what I see. And the veterans that I work with, and the survivors, and all that. Any other questions? Yes.
You're ultimately gonna get to this, but what is the best way to help someone process the trauma so that they can live as happy and healthy a life as possible?
Okay, good question. Section 6, how to help. All right, so everybody's going to find some sort of protocol, philosophy, style, counseling method, or whatever that works for you, and you're going to work through that because everybody's different. One of the things I highly suggest, so hey, everybody take a squirt of this and pass it on. Oh, that one. It's hand sanitizer, but it has a scent. So there's this research about aromatherapy, right, that talks about there's 3 scents that have a lot of research behind it, right? The scent of rose, the scent of eucalyptus, and the scent of lavender, right? So remember that for trauma survivors, what gets triggered the most, the memories are your sight, your smell, and your hearing. So when people are processing, if you can go in and give a soothing something, right, it helps them. Because what it does is it keeps everything from flooding. So then they're able to process more on a cognitive level versus the emotional level, right? So I love this one, right? The eucalyptus, I don't know why. A couple of years ago, someone gave me that, and it's like, oh my goodness. So I would be coming home from a late day of counseling, or those 10 client in a day things, and I'd be like squirting myself. Oh, it just calms you, right? Because the power, right, of what it stimulates. And as you calm down, you're building another schema, right? You're building a calm schema that now you can pull out from time to time. And now it gets, you smell it and instantly you feel relaxed. So one of the things you can do when dealing with trauma is you can set an environment where there's a candle, where you can have people say, hey, do you want some of this? Or you can explain it. But I definitely use scent, right? Because it de-escalates. There's all kinds of research about, I do a lot of anger management, mandatory stuff for Seminole County. So if I know someone's coming in, I light the lavender candle, right? Because when it comes in and they smell it, they actually calm down and they have no idea why. Like no one likes to come to counseling, especially if it's mandatory, right? They're coming in and pretty soon we're laughing and everything. I'm thinking, because it's right beside them, right? Like they sit here, it's right there. So there's all kinds of research. So scent makes a big difference. So whatever your version of therapy is, try to do it in the best practice possible for trauma-informed care. I would suggest using the aromatherapy to whatever way you can, or do some research about it. Yes?
I find a really good way is a diffuser, because I do have like lavender and
Okay.
diffuser, and it works very well.
And did you hear that she has a diffuser that she uses? There's little candle things you can plug in, but definitely scent. Now don't do something that all of a sudden everybody's sleeping, right? You've gone too far. Even though it feels good to bill for a nap, but that's just not good. I don't know, that's probably not good. Yeah, that's what it is. We did relaxation therapy. How do you feel? I'm good. Well, you slept 2 hours, so that second is cash rate. So. You got your card on file, don't worry. We're going to do a thing on billing later, so this is how you get rich. So we're going to talk about the mandala, or mandala, whatever, however you pronounce it. Dina will do that when she gets back up here. Remember, too, if you don't feel safe, you're not going to process the trauma in a good way. So you can create the best environment on the planet in a counseling office, right? It's very safe, very whatever. And if they go home and it's not safe, then what you do is you open them up. They start to trust, and then you go over here and they get re-traumatized because they've opened up. So the difficulty is with trauma, to really be successful, you've got to make sure safety is in both places. So a lot of times I have to get the family or whoever the trauma survivor is living with, if I can, involved. So they understand the dynamic, because unfortunately, a lot of people that are in relationship with trauma survivors make it about them. Poor me, because I'm living with this person. Or they'll say, well, what about me? And I want to say, well, what about you? Get over it. No, you can't go say that. So you have to explain to them the same thing. So they have to understand, oh, they're not just making this up, or they're not having an affair on me, or all of a sudden the libido just didn't dry up. There's a reason, right? So I help them understand. Men who are in a relationship with a woman who's a survivor, right? I always explain to them sex. Because a man, stereotypically, now it's just stereotypes, right? So don't take this wrong. A man, when they have an orgasm, it doesn't matter how they have it. They have an orgasm, right? At that moment, they get dopamine released, which is a drug, right? Like if you had a button, forget sex, just you'd be pushing the button because you want dopamine. And they get oxytocin, right? So the stereotype you hear of, I love makeup sex. Well, why? They love makeup sex because we've had a knockdown, drag out, or something, right? And I'm feeling down. I go have sex, I have an orgasm, I get dopamine injected right into my brain, and I get a wash of oxytocin, and I'm feeling like everything is great. Because it creates an illusion. It blocks your memory, you forget what just happened, and then you literally feel everything is good. When I first started out counseling, right, I only did marriage counseling, right, and I would ask people, what's your gauge that your relationship is good? Every guy back then would say, my sex life. But they're really not saying is how often we have sex. What they're really saying is, look, anytime I can fool my brain into thinking everything is great, I want it. And if this is the way I get it, I want it. They don't know that's what's happening. They also think that their partner, if she's a woman, right, every time they have sex, her brain is telling her the same thing. That's not exactly right? Because a woman gets oxytocin when they feel safe and secure. They can have an orgasm galore. No oxytocin. It's just like, oh, well, that was good. No, whatever. Right? Do your thing. Let's move on. Because they're not getting the oxytocin. And it's really important, right, that if you're talking to a male partner of a female survivor, that they understand that the female survivor is not experiencing this incredible drug high that you're experiencing. It's the exact opposite. You're experiencing it, you're looking over to them, and they're being repulsed, right? They're like, you have to understand. So I have to explain that to them, because otherwise they're going to want, especially if it's an older survivor who now starts to remember, and they had a good sex life, they're not going to understand that why she doesn't want to be touched. You have to understand, right? Chemistry is going crazy. So I try to get them to understand, because if I can get the partner to understand what the survivor goes through, I can help create safety, right? And if you help create safety, it's a better place. So you really have to do your best to do that. Now, sometimes it's out of your hands, and it's really frustrating, but in an ideal world, right, you try to establish that. I was told there's 3 things you can do to really manipulate mood naturally, right? Years ago. If you can get up early in the morning and expose your skin or your eyes to the early morning sunlight, not staring into it, right, but just exposing, and the sunlight hits your skin and registers off your eyes, you get this incredible chemical reaction, and you get a lot of chemicals, because the early morning sunlight is very powerful. You also get a lot of vitamin D, which is directly kind of connected to serotonin and other things, so it elevates mood, right? So if you get people early to go out, it makes a big difference. If you tell them, look, even if you just go for a walk for 10 minutes, because exercise is really healthy. If you go for a 10-minute walk, but you do it in a mindful way. So you're not just like walking, you're thinking, oh, the air feels good. I can feel it, like, oh, I just walked through a cold spot. Or if you're mindful of your environment, right, it creates good, positive chemicals. So that early morning sunlight, being mindful, right, and then sleep, going to bed early. I had this one doctor tell me that if you go to sleep like at 9, the hours of 9 to midnight, more positive chemicals are secreted in your brain than all the other hours of the night put together. So it's that early evening time, which that kind of shoots it all for us, because if you go to bed at 9. Right? So, right, you can also remember, vitamin D is important, B12, B6, omega-3, those things have a lot of research behind them that help with mood and recovery. So when you're dealing with somebody, right, remember, you have to create that place of safety, you have to process, you try to explain as much, you try to get them to get from here to here. So I always have them write in some way, journal. They don't have to journal specifically about tell me what happened, but journal. I tell them write a letter every day. If they're religious, write to your God, whatever that is. Write to your God, write a letter. End on a positive note, but process what's going on, what's happening. Because I tell people, look, trauma is emotional at its core, in my opinion. So then, if I'm feeling it, I can't process it because it's in that emotional state. But if I write about it, then I'm forcing the blood flow and the chemicals out of my bloodstream and forcing this panic feeling up to my cognitive processing. So the act of writing transfers the energy into a cognitive form, and when it's in a cognitive form, I can break it down. I can make sense of it, I can process it. So each time I do that, the potential is the memory or the trauma loses a little bit of its power. So you just keep teaching that, right? So I've been journaling pretty much every morning since 1989, right? And I do it because it's very, very powerful. And it's a form of meditation, and there's just a lot of stuff that allows it to get from that emotional state, right, to a cognitive state, which is really important in processing trauma.
Okay, so what I drew up here, it's called a mandala. Studies show that if a person draws this, or any version of this, there's no specifics to it, whatever works for them, while they're talking, that it kind of creates a barrier between the trauma and them and allows them to process through it a little easier. For me personally, I do better at coloring them than drawing. Like, I'm not a drawer, so you can see by my, like, I got stuck sitting here trying to draw it and even it out, like I got stuck. But studies say, yeah, it's beautiful. But studies say that if you have your client drawing this while they're talking, or doodling in some form, that it causes them to focus on what they're doing, and they feel less of what they're talking about in that moment, so they're able to get more of it out.
Go ahead.
Slightly more specific, if I'm asking you to draw a mandala, what would the instructions be? Draw a circle and then do stuff inside it?
Well, no, what I would tell them is, I would say, look, part of, helping process is drawing, and there's all kinds of research that talks about this mandala, right? So one of the things they tell you to do is get them out a piece of paper and tell them to draw a dot in the middle. And then roughly a ½ inch from the dot, for the 4 ways, draw another dot. So a ½ inch. ½ inch. Then, from that dot, you want to go 1 inch. And then from that dot, you go 1.5 inches. So, you get the idea, right? And then you have them draw a circle and a circle and a circle, right? And you just tell them to kind of doodle, and you show them some examples of the mandala. So So what happens is once again, they're taking this emotional energy, right, and they're allowing it to be processed in a cognitive way while they're processing and talking about some heavy emotional stuff. So it transfers that emotional energy into cognitive energy. When it's in cognitive form, you can process. So it's just something that there's a lot of research on, right? And you know, some people, they'll say, try to have people do it every morning. Get up and draw your mandala, then color it in or whatever. And some people just don't want to draw. We'll have some people in an addiction group that will have coloring, adult coloring books, and they'll be, as they're processing, they'll be coloring because that helps them process. Yes?
What do you think about printing it out and having them trace over it if they don't want to draw?
Yep.
Something like
Yeah.
that.
Like Nina gets them pre-printed. You get books of them, right? And then she just uses, that's already made. I'm a person that this would help me because I am visual and I want to create it, and it helps me in processing. But not everybody, because once again, everybody's different. Yes?
So, Christine, it's more helpful to talk about the trauma without the emotion attached to it.
Well, it depends. Because if you just do that and you never attach the emotion to it, it doesn't go away. So you do have to bring the emotion into it. You just have to teach them how to process through it. And so you can kind of almost imagine a flowing, right? It gets emotional and you sort of process it through the cognitive, right? You get emotional and you process it through the cognitive. Because if you have trauma and you just stay cognitive, you will process it at all.
It's a way of not being flooded.
So you just lock everything away. You become an expert. Like I know every verbiage, but you've never connected it to here to here. Yeah.
That's kind of easier to have them talk cognitively about it, but to connect to our is what's harder.
Yeah, so it's tricky.
That's helpful. You're saying
Yeah.
if they're having a hard time talking about it, that's helpful.
Yeah, and remember, everything I'm telling you, I could be wrong. Like I'm just letting you know. I believe it works. I use it. It's my research and stuff, doesn't mean you have to do any of it. Use whatever you want to use. But be a lifelong learner, right? Because we are learning more and more about how to help trauma survivors. And there's more and more people, right? Even this Me Too campaign, right? This is not like a little thing, right? Those people are trauma survivors, at least the majority of them. The question I want to ask them is what did you do to heal? You can't just throw that out there, right, and get a moment of whatever. What did you do to heal? Okay. I'm not sure. Now, someone handed us a question. I don't know if we addressed that indirectly. Yes?
Yeah, that was my question, and no, I still have the question. The question is, okay, I understand that you're saying process emotions, but here's what I've observed in working with survivors, and I've worked a lot over the years with male survivors, which is another tricky issue, because what you were talking about with the sex doesn't always apply. I've had male survivors who refrain from ejaculation because it makes them feel too vulnerable. They want to please their partner, but I don't want to feel vulnerable. But my question was, the sticking point seems to be the perception, the self-identification of, because this horrible sexual thing happened to me as a child, then I am bad. This horrible, depraved thing. And the two categories of survivors I've worked a lot with are survivors of incest. And in one particular case, this person was molested chronically by both father and mother. And then Boy Scout survivors. I was in a case where this leader had molested 200 kids over many decades. And so, and what seems common among all of them, and it's sort of entrenched, how do you get out of this? I am still a bad human being because this happened to me.
Right.
Especially with male survivors, I should have been taught, but good Lord, you were 8, you were 9. This was your mother and your father, and you were 12. So my question was, therapeutically, how do you shift that perception, that cognitive frame that I am bad, versus, my metaphor often is you're a diamond in a manure pile, and just because you're covered with shit doesn't mean you are shit.
Right.
The diamond is untouched. But if you have any techniques of how to, because I find that so
when I work with male survivors especially, I do a heavy focus on the brain chemistry.
On the what?
The brain chemistry. Because if I can prove to them that what happens when your brain and how it changes, and I can give different examples that have nothing to do with trauma, right? Then I can, if they can start to see that, wait a second, how I think is conditioned in different ways, right? If they can buy into that concept, then you can lead them out. But they have to somehow understand that something is beyond their control. And so to me, the brain chemistry gets them to see that, right? Because if they can see, oh my goodness, this is what's going on in my brain, now what do I have to do? How can you shift it? How can, you know, so I use that. So to me, that's been the most powerful tool I've ever discovered when it deals with trauma.
I think getting them to see and really understand choices. So getting them to describe to you, like, what is bad outside of trauma, not having anything to do with trauma, like what do they describe as bad or a bad person, and then looking into choices. Did they make this choice? Okay, well, what's the difference between something being done to you and you making a choice for something? Using outside perspectives. If person A experienced this, are they bad? Because you're saying that a bad person makes choices, so you kind of walk them down that path as well. And sometimes being able to see that in that circumstance, in that situation, they did not have a choice, but now they do, allows them to kind of grasp onto the possibility that, you know, they aren't bad, that something bad happened to them.
Yes.
I have a patient that's brings up trauma in sessions, but circularly, she's currently living in a rehab, so she doesn't associate the rehab as safe. Should I encourage her to talk about her trauma?
No.
So if the home environment's not safe, no. But what if the client is insisting about talking about trauma?
I would talk about it, but I would talk about it. Remember, there's layers of depth, right? So communication-wise, there's layer one, but very surfacey. I call it rowboat, snorkel, just below the surface, scuba diver, deep sea diver, submarine, right? So if I'm processing with someone that's not in a safe environment, I only go so far, right? Because if they open up, then someone's going to come in there and it really breaks down their defense until they, I tell people, don't begin to explore trauma unless you're willing to go through the whole process and be whatever healing is for you. Because otherwise you start it and stop and it gets worse. And you guys can go too. We'll just sit here and take some questions, but thank you very much. But yeah.
When you were particularly talking about sort of the disconnect and not really doing the social aspects of life, I mean, how do you overcome that literally by setting reminders in your phone? Hey, I need to text so-and-so because, in this number of weeks. I mean,
well, because what happens for me is when I see the text come up or I'm looking at my calendar and I see that on there, I force myself to go in and identify the emotions. Why do I have to do this? Okay, well, this person is my friend. They're there for me. I care about them. They care about me. These are some of the memories we've shared.